Hello, welcome to the plenary session of the Utah State Historical Society's 68th Annual Conference. I'm Dr. Holly George of Utah Historical Quarterly, and today we are considering Native American voting rights. Our moderator today is Dustin Jansen, Director of the Utah Division of Indian Affairs and Professor at Utah Valley University. The plenary is also being streamed live on our Utah History Facebook page. A question and answer period will follow the panel presentations, and we ask that you submit your questions via the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll also try to moderate or monitor what's coming in on Facebook. With that, I am going to turn the time to Mr. Jansen. Sir?
Well, thank you. If there's any Navajos out there, Ya'ate, Dustin Jansen and Shia. Donet Nishlinegi Kintlachinin Michalyn, Billigana Bashichin, although Honogani Dashachedo, Billigana Dashanella, Kutego Din Nishla. So if we're related, I feel sorry for you. I'm just kidding. No, it's good to meet you, and I'm glad you're able to be here. I'm currently an assistant professor at Utah Valley University. I teach American Indian Studies and political science, and I'm serving as the director of Utah Division of Indian Affairs for this wonderful state here. And I've been asked to moderate this panel. And just to introduce everyone that's here and helping us out, we have Ronnie Joe Draper, PhD, and she's a professor in the David O. McKay School of Education at Brigham Young University, where she teaches courses in literacy, multicultural education, and women's studies. Her scholarship has appeared in various journals for researchers and teachers, including the Harvard Educational Review and the American Educational Research Journal, the Journal of Teacher Education, and the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy. She's an editor and contributor to the books Reimagining Content, Area Literacy Instruction, and Arts Education and Literacies. Ronnie Joe is also a producer for the Marissa Lila directed documentary film Good Fire, as well as the Jared Hess directed documentary Navajo Mountain High. In addition to her university work, Ronnie Joe also works as an advocate for social justice in her community. She serves as the vice president of the Utah County chapter of PFLAG and the president of the board of the ACLU of Utah and on the national board of the ACLU. So we welcome Dr. Draper here with us. Also on our panel, we have Justin Lee, who is the director of elections for the state of Utah. It's a position that reports to the lieutenant governor, and he has been in his current role for nearly 3 years and previously served as the deputy director of elections for the state since 2012. Justin received his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Utah and a master's degree in political science from USU. So welcome, Mr. Lee. We appreciate you being here. And we have Michalyn Steele, and she's a 2001 graduate of the Georgetown University Law Center. She also holds a BA and an MA in humanities from Brigham Young University. She is currently the Francis R. Kirkland Professor of Law at BYU Law, where she teaches federal Indian law, civil rights, constitutional law, and evidence. Prior to joining the faculty, Michalyn worked as a counselor to Assistant Secretary Larry Echohawk at the Department of Interior, as a trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and as an associate at the DC tribal law firm of Sonosky Chambers. So we're very happy that they're all here. And I feel like it's a very good panel that can really answer a lot of questions and deliver a lot of good information, especially as it pertains to Utah and the United States in general. So I'm really excited for this. This isn't really a subject that comes up a lot, and so I've just to give you some broad strokes on the history of Indian voting in the United States, I thought I'd share my screen a little bit real quick and give you a brief history. So I'm gonna pick a couple things, and so it looks like it's all showing up. So one of the first things that I get a lot in my classes is that, you know, with the 14th Amendment, It's hard for people to imagine that Native American people weren't allowed to vote just right away, right? The 14th Amendment, it allowed, most people within the United States to become citizens and to participate in the voting process. But it wasn't always interpreted that way for Native people, and that interpretation didn't always. It came through in a Supreme Court case called Elk v. Wilkins, where the Supreme Court stated that a Native person who is not unnaturalized or taxed or recognized as a citizen either by the U.S. or by the state is not a citizen of the United States within the meaning of the first section of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And I found a quote that was given early by Michigan Senator Jacob Howard. He goes, "I'm not yet prepared to pass a sweeping act of naturalization by which all the Indian savages, wild or tame, belonging to a tribal relation are to become my fellow citizens or go to the polls and vote with me." So the sentiment towards Native people to be included in voting just wasn't there, which is odd, because for a lot of, in comparison to other ethnic minorities in the U.S., who were being kind of were trying to be stopped from becoming U.S. citizens. Prior to this, the U.S. was really trying to force American Indians into the mainstream and to assimilate, and so to not allow them to vote and to go that far was surprising. Let me see. Did I skip that there? I did skip it. So, and then it wasn't until the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act that was passed that Native people won the right of full citizenship when President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act. But it didn't always mean that Native American people at the time had full-fledged participation in what it means to be a U.S. citizen. And for some people, the 1924 Indian Citizenship Act wasn't just to make Native people part of the U.S., but it was also to break up their own sovereign nations, and to open up land for expansion and relieve the United States from its federal trust responsibilities towards tribes. But even though they were citizens even here in 1924, a lot of Native people weren't allowed to participate fully, especially in this context of voting, until 1962. So 1962, it wasn't that far away. For any of my students watching, that seems like a long time ago, but it really wasn't. It was just back a little bit, and the last state to allow Native people to vote was our state of Utah right here, and so we're trying to build off that and better that situation. The Voting Rights Act of '65 helped to strengthen the voting rights of Native people. What that did was it asked that tribes or states that had a history of probably not allowing full participation in voting to all their citizens, before they made changes to their voting laws, they would have to get those things cleared. But in 2013, in the Supreme Court case of Shelby County v. Holder, that section of the Voting Rights Act was disregarded, and it opened up the possibility for states to institute voting restrictions or requirements that may have adverse effect on different communities in their state. And when that came out, we could see what happened in North Dakota in 2018, where North Dakota required everyone that wanted to vote to have a valid state ID, right? And they weren't recognizing tribal identification to show residency within their state. And that doesn't seem like a big deal, what they also required was that these voters, if you wanted to vote in North Dakota, you had to have a residential street address. And this created a huge problem because for a lot of reservations, there are roads there are streets, but they don't normally have names associated with it. You know, most people get their mail in rural areas through the PO box, the post office system. And so this really knocked out a huge chunk of North Dakota who wanted to participate in state voting. And if these sections that were struck down in the Shelby County v. Holder case were not struck down, that would have been something that would have had to been reviewed before it went into place. Okay, so I think that's where I'm going to stop for a second right there. And that's just to give you a big, broad picture of the history of Native American voting within the United States. And I'd like to turn some time over, and we're going to start with Ms. Ronnie Joe Draper and have her present, and we'll move on to Justin Lee, and then on to Michalyn Steele, and then we'll start fielding questions. I think it was said to you that there's a question answer button that you can start submitting questions as we go. I'll be going through those. And then I think would be a good idea would just be to, if you're not presenting, you can probably just turn your mic off and maybe stop your video so attention can be focused on the person presenting, and we can go from there. Ms. Draper.
Thank you. Ayakwi, Niknau Ronnie Joe Draper. I'm an enrolled member of the Yurok tribe. My people are from the village of Witchpeck at the fork of the Klamath and Trinity Rivers in Northern California. So I'm a little bit away from my homelands. I'm a teacher educator, as I've been introduced at BYU. And I came by this work as by way of mathematics teaching. And I'm currently, as was mentioned, the president of the board of the ACLU of Utah and a member of the national board of the ACLU. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, is a non-governmental, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that began over 100 years ago to realize the promise of the U.S. Constitution, which in part is is to create a more perfect union. And part of the mission of the ACLU is to expand the reach of the U.S. Constitution and the guarantees of the Constitution to all people. And as Dustin has pointed out, the Constitution has been in place for a very long time, but its promises and its reach haven't always extended to all the people in the United States. And part of what the ACLU has done is really work to extend that. The ACLU of Utah just celebrated 60 years of work in Utah last year, and we accomplish our work primarily through suing the government on the behalf of individuals. Over the past 5 years or so here in Utah, and more specifically in San Juan County, we have sued the government in San Juan County in order to remove barriers to voting for people living on the Navajo reservation, or Navajo Nation. And those barriers have included mail-in only voting, lack of polling sites that are within reasonable distances for people living on the Navajo Nation, and translation services of election information. So at this point, it's clear that I'm not a historian, and that I was worried a little bit about being part of this panel at a history conference. I'm also not an expert on voting rights, but like many Indigenous women of a certain age, I do have my thoughts about such things, and I am glad to be part of this conversation and to address all of you and offer some of my insights. I would like to say just a few words on the overall project of colonization. because we often think about colonization as an event or an era that happened in the past. But colonization is an ongoing project, and it's born out of white supremacy. And colonization is this project in which colonized people are separated from their land, their ceremonies, their families, their culture, their language, their sustenance, their bodies, their resources, and their very lives. The purpose of the separation is for colonizers to gain access, control, power over land, bodies, resources, for material gain. And I'm sure that it takes very little imagination to reflect on the colonization of the Americas to see how indigenous peoples were separated from their land, and to see how indigenous Africans were separated from their land, brought to American shores, and sold as chattel labor for the material gain of colonizers. And so we have this long history of people being separated, and children being separated from families. My grandmother was separated from her family and sent to a boarding school. She lost her language, and she was separated from her food and from her from the people that she loved. And so all those things take place on Yurok lands. Indigenous peoples were barred from fishing, from their cultural burning of the forest, from hunting. They were separated essentially then from sources of food, from sources of medicine, from resources that they would use for making shelter, clothing, baskets, nets, and all the ways in which they could remain sovereign. And so I think that we have to keep that in mind as we're talking about the right to vote. This idea of colonization and voting are completely intermingled. And we often, as citizens, as we go through school, aren't really trained, aren't really taught how to see the world around us, and to see the events around us as a project of ongoing colonization. In fact, when we're in school, we're taught that about the history of colonization, and we're taught about it as something that happened in the past. We're taught to celebrate it. It's all about the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, the founding fathers, opening trade routes. And we're not even really, it's not even pointed out at that time that those trade routes never really benefited indigenous peoples. And we just don't see how our policies that we have right now, policies that were written into the Constitution, policies that are written into how voting policies, educational policies, policies around healthcare, policies around land management, forests, all kinds of things, immigration, how those continue to play out as projects of colonization. And so I just want to be able to put that out as something for us to consider as we discuss these things. We're here to discuss voting rights for Native Americans, and voting rights matter, or else we wouldn't have to fight so hard about who we allow to vote, and how we create barriers to voting. But we know that voting is a way of speaking. It is a way of declaring ourselves. It is voting impacts who represents us. Voting impacts conversations, like I said, about land management, school curriculum, who has access to healthcare, reproductive rights, how women and children are protected, the judicial processes and policies, and ultimately even who has access to material wealth and well-being. And so to me, it's not a surprise that as soon as white men wrote a document establishing elections, they worked to control and limit who got to participate in those elections. And it's not a surprise that we are still arguing about it. And I imagine that we'll continue to argue about it. So I guess most simply, Indigenous peoples were removed from places and then were told we had no addresses. We were removed from our land and told we didn't belong. We don't belong to this land. We were born within the borders of the US and told we're not citizens of America. We were refused our words and then denied our voice. So let's talk about it. Waklau. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Draper, for those words. I appreciate that, and I think as we move forward, we're gonna through the panelists, we're gonna see all these different subjects and all these things come together, and I'm excited to see how that happens and unfolds. So I appreciate your words and sharing those things. The next panelist I'd like to introduce is Justin Lee. Like I said, Mr. Lee serves as the Director of Elections for the state of Utah, and we'll give him some time to present and talk a little bit about what he's doing. I appreciate you being here, Justin.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, Dustin. I appreciate being here. First let me start off by maybe explaining a little bit about what our office does here in the state. So we're the state elections office. The Lieutenant Governor is the chief election officer in the state. So that means we oversee primarily multi-county or federal races, statewide races, is where we have direct authority. Now, where this gets interesting is that each county elects their own county clerk, and the county clerk is the chief election officer in that county. So one of the interesting things that we run into and have run into over the years is sometimes people think there's kind of a employer-employee relationship between our office and the county clerks, that they somehow report to us that we have some kind of authority to hire or fire them, and it's important to make sure that everyone understands that's not the case. County clerks are independently elected officials, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether that's a good system or a bad system, but it's the system that we have, and so we get an interesting scenario sometimes where a county clerk may not be doing something we agree with, and we can call them up, we can talk to them, we can send letters, but one of the things we don't get to do is fire them or remove them from office. That's something the voters would have to do, and that's an interesting dynamic as we talk about some of these issues that have come up, particularly in Utah in the last few years. Dr. Draper just talked about the ACLU, and we have a good relationship with our office in the ACLU, and appreciate the things that they've brought to our attention. Most people probably know this, but if anyone doesn't, we have 29 counties here in the state of Utah, and we have a small staff here in our own office. We don't have a very large staff, and we don't always know what's going on everywhere. So we appreciate ACLU and other groups that are able to bring things to our attention from time to time, and as we'll talk about a little bit here, also actually appreciate the fact that they take people to court from time to time. I don't think anyone loves to go to court, but there are reasons the court exists, and there are disputes that are really meant for the courts, or I guess the courts are one of the best venues to deal with them when you have people who are somewhat intransigent, perhaps, or doing things that are not helping out voters. So what I'd like to spend a couple of minutes doing is I'd like to talk about how elections have changed in Utah in the last decade, really, and some of the impacts that has had, particularly in San Juan County, where we've seen some of the biggest discussions, and some of the lessons that we've learned from that. So I'm gonna see if I can share my screen here. All right, and I think that is working. So we've got, so first off, I'd like to jump back to 2010. 2010 is important for a few reasons. One, that's when I started working in this office. So my institutional memory doesn't go much further back than 2010, other than things that people tell me. Also, 2010 was the last time in Utah that we had all 29 counties running elections in the same way. So what we had in 2010 is in-person voting on election day was the norm. Everyone had 2 weeks of early voting, in-person early voting. In-person voting was on touchscreen machines, and any voter could request an absentee ballot. And 2010 is the last time that everyone is really on the same format of running their elections. All elections ran the same way. And then everything started to change. In 2012, there was a law passed that allowed any election to be run entirely by absentee ballot, more commonly said by mail. Now in 2012, we only had one county that took them up on that. Duchesne County decided to run their election by mail. 28 other counties, though, everyone else was still doing in-person election day, 2 weeks of in-person early voting on the touchscreen machines, and any voter could request an absentee ballot. Another interesting piece of legislation in 2014 now was that the legislature passed a bill and allowed any county to participate in a pilot project which allowed voters to register at the polls on election day. Now there were people, Representative Rebecca Chavez-Hauk did phenomenal work on this, who wanted this passed, just have election day registration. But it couldn't quite make it through the legislature. So the compromise was, let's do a pilot project. Let's see how this works out. And so some counties started doing that. So let's fast forward to 2014 now. We now had 19 counties who were doing what we're going to call traditional polling place elections, in-person polling place, 2 weeks of early voting, in-person voting on the touchscreen machines. Any voter can request an absentee ballot. And then 10 counties who ran their election by mail, and this includes San Juan County. Now this gets very interesting because I'm sure most everybody knows San Juan County is geographically a huge county. It's hard to put this into perspective from people, particularly when we talk to people back east, just how large San Juan County is. It's bigger than states, and really, driving wise, I can drive across most of the state on I-15 in the time it takes me to get around San Juan County we need to. It's just a huge state, a huge county that was running the election by mail. And when they ran that election by mail, they were only using one polling location at the county offices. So there's some issues that start coming up. As was brought up, there's issues with addressing. There's issues getting mail to people sometimes. There's issues with the timeliness of the ballot getting there. PO boxes are used. So while by mail starts looking really good as a solution to running elections, it works really well in a lot of counties. There are some issues in San Juan County. So in 2016, not a lot changes on that front. 9 counties now are only holding traditional elections. 21 counties across the state are doing their elections by mail. We pick up large counties, Salt Lake County, Weber County, Davis County was already doing it. But we start seeing the majority of the state running their election by mail, but San Juan County not really changing what they're doing. So we've got an interesting scenario where under the law, the county only has to have one polling place and they can run their election by mail. So this is an interesting case study where the legislature has passed a law, a county official is enacting that law, but not really thinking perhaps as creatively as could be thought. The bare minimum is one polling location, but there's nothing that says you can't do more than that. And that's where there may have been an opportunity, and I'll say there was an opportunity for a county clerk to say, this is the minimum, but given the population that I have, given the makeup of my county, it might make sense to do more polling places, more in person, because vote by mail is just not working for everybody. So we go to 2018, and during this time, there's a lawsuit filed. And the lawsuit basically says San Juan County needs to do more than just run their election by mail. That's not working well enough. And so they reach a settlement agreement, and the settlement agreement does some very interesting things. One, it reinstitutes multiple polling places on election day. They now have to have 3 polling places on election day. There are satellite offices in the weeks leading up to election day. They have to have a liaison with the Navajo Nation who does training. There's interpretation that needs to take place. There's radio announcements that need to go out. And this is another thing that's interesting. The radio announcements, in a lot of places, that's not the number one way. But when we've worked with, the Navajo Human Rights Commission or HERD, one of the things that our office learned is that these radio announcements are so important to get the word out there. And so that's one of the things our office helped out with, was paying for additional radio announcements in 2018 to make sure people understood how this works, the dates and deadlines. So now we're in 2018, and only 2 counties in the state are using quote unquote traditional voting. 27 counties run their election by mail, picking up Utah County, and San Juan County is running under a settlement agreement. Now this gets really important in 2020. And I, for people who are wondering if I'm going to talk about the redistricting issue, yes, that's there. I'm just jumping over that for 1 second as I go through this timeline. But in March 2020, we get to Super Tuesday, presidential preference, and this is going to be run by the counties this year. So now all 29 counties run their election primarily by mail. There is in-person polling on election day. San Juan County is still operating with the settlement agreement, so making sure there's additional polling places, additional early vote sites, and sending out the ballots earlier than other places. But most counties are running their election the same way. And then on March 11, 2020, Rudy Gobert from the Utah Jazz tests positive for coronavirus. And then everything started to change again and again and again. And we don't have time to talk about all of the changes coronavirus has brought. But it does impact the election. So the good news for Utah is we're already primarily by mail. And this is, for the most part, a very important thing that allows people to social distance. It allows people to vote from the safety of their home. 90% of our voters in the state are actually already voting by mail, so that's a very good thing for us. Now, the legislature starts talking in a special session about suspending all in-person voting, but allowing for drive-through voting. So as that bill is being discussed, our office had concerns knowing that there's the settlement agreement at San Juan County, and other groups. We hear from the Navajo Human Rights Commission, we hear from some attorneys, we hear from the ACLU, all concerned that the bill makes sure that the settlement agreement in San Juan County is still in effect. We don't want any legislation to trump that. And so we work with the legislature and hearing what these groups are saying and having our own concerns, and make sure that the special session legislation makes it very clear that San Juan County is still under that settlement agreement, and no law passed by the legislature will trump that. So while other counties are not going to do in-person voting, San Juan County is still going to have in-person voting for the June primary, to make sure that settlement agreement, and not just the settlement agreement, it's not just about making sure that we're doing what the court said. But because the settlement agreement came to some good solutions, important solutions, we want to make sure that those solutions are still in place so that everyone can vote in the way that works best for them. If vote by mail works, great. If someone needs to go to one of these in-person places, we want to make sure that's available. And also it's important that people be able to register to vote on election day if there's been a problem before that. So looking ahead to 2020, good news for most states, again, we're already by mail, so we don't have to make a lot of the changes that you're hearing about in other states that are implementing vote by mail in what's taken us 8 years to work out. They're trying to do it in 8 months or less in some cases. So all 29 counties will run their elections by mail. Legislature allowed for indoor, outdoor, drive-through voting, which is going to be interesting to see. But again, San Juan County will continue to work under that settlement agreement. So as we look over some of these things that have happened over the last years here in Utah, lessons that I think I've learned and others have learned is, while something may work really well in most of the state, it doesn't necessarily work well everywhere. And I think San Juan County is a good example where, some early creativity could have probably, kept it out of court. But despite that, just because it worked, vote by mail works in a lot of places, some counties, and San Juan's a good example of this, and this is probably true in some other states, as they look to implement vote by mail, making sure that whatever solution you're picking is serving the population that you have. If you have voters who have difficulty with by mail, if the post office system is not working as well, then making sure you have those opportunities to vote in person are important. And so there's been changes in San Juan County, that settlement agreement is in place, and hopefully that is working well. One of the things that we did in 2018, which we've never done before, is we actually sent people from our office to observe the election in San Juan County, to see how things were working and make sure the settlement agreement, among other things, was being fulfilled. And other people, ACLU and others, has poll watchers there as well. And we want to continue making sure that we don't take any steps back there, that any legislation that takes place in the state or other efforts in the state continue to give voters those access to their rights. That's really what we're talking about here, is making sure everyone has access to their rights. So we look forward to seeing what happens in the future, but are grateful for those groups who have kept working and making sure that everyone has their right to vote. So I'll stop it there and be ready to answer any questions later. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Justin. I really appreciate that presentation, and having working with the Navajo Nation a lot lately, I know I can tell you that the Navajo Nation has been very happy and about how the state of Utah is accommodating their voting request. And just, I think it's important to understand why San Juan County Navajo Nation wanted in-person voting. It was actually just, it's cultural reasons. You should be able to choose your leaders face to face or in person. Even though your actual leaders won't be there, to show up and vote in person is a cultural right. And so for the state to recognize that and to accommodate that, it was a very big step, and I know Navajo Nation appreciates it greatly. So I thought I'd just clear that really fast, throw that in there, and so help people understand. Next we have Michalyn Steele, who will turn some time over so she can share a few words. I'm seeing some questions show up in the question and answer prompt, and I'm waiting for Michalyn Steele's words and to see if those questions get answered during there before we start addressing those. But if they don't, we'll start sharing them. Panelists, if you see the question and answer prompt on the bottom, you can look at those and review those if you'd like. But we'll turn time over to Ms. Michalyn Steele. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for inviting me, and I appreciate what my co-panelists have taught us and shared today. So I come at this as a civil rights lawyer, having worked at the Department of Justice for 6 years, working as a trial attorney, working to enforce civil rights. My primary enforcement responsibilities were with regard to the Fair Housing Act, but we shared office space, we shared a floor with the voting section and the federal attorneys who enforced the Federal Voting Rights Act. Many of you may be familiar with the sort of the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where John Lewis, who recently passed, and others sought to march from Selma to Birmingham to petition for their voting rights. Many of the focus points of the civil rights movement were on the hope of securing voting rights. Those jurisdictions there was a jurisdiction in Mississippi that imposed all kinds of tests before you could register to vote. If you've ever seen the movie Selma, which depicts some of this story, you see the character played by Oprah trying to register to vote, and they ask her a series of ever more complex questions, such as, how many county judges are there, and how many counties are there, how many county judges are there, and then when she seems to know the answer, they say, name them. And so it's ever more complex, and these are the ways in which states were interfering in the right to vote, even though after the Civil War, the Reconstruction Amendments, including the 14th Amendment, requiring states to provide equal protection and not discriminate on the basis of race, which, as Dustin noted, did not include for Native Americans the right to vote, and the 15th Amendment, which specifically prohibits states from discriminating in the right to vote on the basis of race. Neither the 14th nor the 15th Amendment accommodated the rights of women until the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. And specifically for Native Americans, there was more work to be done, really until the Voting Rights Act clarified that members of tribes and speakers of native languages were entitled to have states protect their voting rights. Your right to vote as a citizen does not necessarily derive from your citizen your citizenship as in the United States. Voting and elections are run by states, and your right to vote in many ways derives from, or is carried out at least through the auspices of the state. And I think, we're lucky to have someone like Justin, who is committed to the principle of equal access to the ballot. That has not always been so. It is not always so in the way elections are carried out. But as Dustin mentioned, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, one after Selma and the march and the sort of bloody Sunday, the folks who were beaten on the bridge there and for insisting on their right to vote. I always think about a man whose family, he was just registering people to vote in Florida. And it was a very dangerous thing to register people to vote, register Black people in particular to vote in the 60s. And there were a number of people who were killed, firebombed, their houses were dynamited for engaging in the activity of registering people to vote. There was, like I was saying, there's a county in Mississippi that required you to say how many bubbles were contained in a bar of soap before they would register you to vote. These were all, of course, pretexts to disenfranchise on the basis of race and poverty and other factors, those who they did not want to have the exercise of the vote. The reason the vote is so important in striking down a poll tax in Virginia. Everyone had to pay a poll tax in order to vote in Virginia, and the Supreme Court struck that down in 1966, not that long ago. And in so finding, meaning you can't have these kind of barriers to voting. States can't erect these kind of barriers to voting and get away with it after the Voting Rights Act. They found that that voting is a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all the other rights. The exercise of all your other rights under the Constitution hinge on the protection, the sanctity of your right to vote. I have been very interested to watch and participate in the ways that members of tribes and Native American people have claimed that franchise, just as they have served disproportionately in the armed forces and have stepped forward to defend the country. They have claimed and exercised the right to vote. I saw a question in the Q&A. I haven't seen all of them, but I did see the first one about the right to vote for Native Americans in Utah. As I recall, that seemed like it was there. With the 1924 Citizenship Act, it still didn't necessarily guarantee the rights of citizenship, including voting, per L.V. Wilkins, and subsequent cases. But my understanding is the Attorney General of Utah had issued an opinion in around 1940 that said that Native Americans could vote. But a subsequent Attorney General in the mid-50s issued a contrary opinion saying that Native Americans could not vote. And so in part, those who carry out the vote are directed by the Attorney General and the governor and those who are empowered. And so I think that's why there's conflicting dates about when Utah carried out its responsibility to allow Native people to vote. But there was a case out of from a member of the Ute tribe, which eventually I think didn't get decided on the merits because Utah agreed that they could vote, and that was probably around 1957. So one of the major cases from the Supreme Court that talks about the relationship, the very fraught relationship between states and tribes. I mean, I think Utah is trying to do better. I know that the relationships are still complicated and fraught. But the Supreme Court observed in a case in 1886, a case called Kagama, they said, Indian communities owe no allegiance to the states, receive from them no protection. Because of local ill feeling, the people of the state where they are found are often their deadliest enemies. So that was the state of things in 1886. And tribes and states have tried to, for the most part, to move out of that relationship from being deadliest enemies to have their interests at cross purposes, and have tried to work together. And I think the kinds of efforts in San Juan County that Justin was describing are indicative of that. The Navajo Nation did sue San Juan County for violating one particular section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which requires that states and localities not discriminate on the basis of race or on language for significant language minorities. and the way that the county had set up its, had drawn its districts for county commission election. This was not the state of Utah, this was a county election, and the allegation was that that was diluting Navajo votes. And so the way the districts were drawn, the 3 county commissioners, the tribal members could only sort of have sway really in one of those districts. And so they alleged that those boundaries were drawn on the basis of race, that were drawn to disperse or dilute the Navajo vote and voice in county governance. The federal court agreed and found that the way those districts were drawn did intentionally discriminate on the basis of race, under violating the 14th Amendment and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That was upheld on appeal at the 10th Circuit. And so those districts were redrawn, and now for purposes of county governance, for purposes of school board elections, the Navajo have a more proportional representation to the extent that they vote, their votes are cast in similar ways. Those votes have more of a chance of more fairly representing their population, more proportionally representing their population. So one of the factors under the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is that if there are more than 10,000 or greater than 5% of a particular language in a particular district, that the state must provide translation or interpretation of the ballot in that minority language. If the jurisdiction is covered, there's a formula that determines the coverage. San Juan County, Utah is a covered jurisdiction for purposes of what we call Section 203, which means San Juan County is responsible to provide accurate interpretation of the ballot, to do outreach, and all materials should be available to native Navajo speakers in the Navajo language. And so I suppose that is one of the things that will be monitored in when we talk about election monitoring and poll watching. That's one of the things that we would watch for. When I was at the Department of Justice, because we shared office space with the voting rights section, when elections happened during my 6 years there, we all got conscripted and were sent out as poll watchers to gather evidence for the Federal Department of Justice to assess whether the states and localities were complying with their obligations. And so I spent many elections in New Mexico and Arizona observing, well, we would train people who were native speakers to observe and report on the quality of the ballot interpretation and instructions and things like that to access. I always remember being in a small precinct on the Navajo Nation and kind of watching what was going on there and watching the interpretation of the ballot. I'm not a Navajo speaker. I'm a member of the Seneca Nation from Western New York. But we had Navajo speakers watching the interpretation of the ballot and assessing the quality of that interpretation. And there was a very senior elder, a lady who had walked a great distance to be able to cast her vote. And in quite hot, arid conditions. And unfortunately, she took ill once she got to the polling place and was not able to cast her vote. They had to get medical attention for her. But I've always thought of her every election day and the tremendous effort that she went to ensure that her voice, and a very respected elder on the Navajo Nation, how far she had walked and how much she had worked to make her voice count. And then just because of how remote it was for her, she was not able to actually cast that vote. And I think of her. In the 2018 elections, I went to North Dakota. As I think Dustin mentioned, North Dakota seemed to be very concerned about, the vote that their significant Native American population swaying the vote in ways that other members of the populace didn't like. And so it did make the difference and get in a couple of elections in 2016 and prior to that. And so they enacted what was in essence what they said was a neutral regulation, that you had to have a traditional mailing address and to be able to vote. And so I was on the Spirit Lake Reservation in North Dakota, and they just didn't have traditional addresses, right? They didn't have a house number. We in Utah can't relate because we're on this grid, and everybody in I guess I should say in northern Utah, they can relate in more rural parts of the state, but there just wasn't sort of street addresses. And then the tribal IDs did not have a street address because most of the tribal members didn't have a street address. My experience there in the Spirit Lake was to make sure that the officials from North Dakota that were operating a polling place on the Spirit Lake Reservation were accepting the tribal IDs. The tribe, this decision, they challenged it. The decision came about 2 weeks before the November 2018 election. And so the tribe was scrambling to assign addresses and then print new tribal IDs. There was a machine where they were printing new tribal IDs and assigning addresses on the day of the election, and people were waiting in very long lines. But the interesting thing about that is that even if, and this is not what the court found, but just as a normative matter, if the intent of North Dakota was to try to throw up some obstacles for the tribes to vote, my experience in 2018 was that animated the tribal members, and they voted in record numbers in the 2018 election. They blew through those obstacles. The tribe facilitated tribal IDs with the appropriate address, and it was not easy, but they did it. And so I think that's interesting, that sometimes throwing up these kinds of obstacles can be counterproductive for those who would impede minority voices in voting, because it's certainly, at least in 2018 on the Spirit Lake Reservation, because so much emphasis had been placed on the attempts of North Dakota officials to perhaps thwart their vote, they showed up in record numbers. I'll close with this. There is a Native American Voting Rights Coalition in Congress right now. They have held a series of hearings, and they have proposed a Native American Voting Rights Act. There's also proposals to restore what Shelby County interfered with, struck down, which was a part of Section 4 and Section 5 rather than Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We just in remembrance of Justice Ginsburg, she wrote a blistering dissent on the Shelby County versus Holder case, where striking down. So just in very brief, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act had a formula that said if your county or your state had a history of discriminating on the basis of race, like if you had a soap bubbles test, that kind of thing, then you were a covered jurisdiction, and before you could change your voting laws, the Department of Justice had to pre-clear or authorize that those were not going to negatively affect voting rights. And what the court did in Shelby County was strike that down and say, well, it worked, and there's not really voter discrimination anymore, and so we can't have that formula anymore. And Justice Ginsburg, in one of her more striking dissents, she said, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And I think those words were somewhat prophetic. We have seen the rise of discriminatory voting measures, including on the basis of race, since the Shelby County decision. The Congress has tried to pass a new Voting Rights Act, but there's a specific commission that's working on the restoration of Native Voting Rights Act. They held a series of hearings, 9 field hearings in the last couple of years, and they have basically they've introduced a bill that would require allow tribes to designate polling places, that they would be more accessible. They've identified the barriers such as non-traditional addresses and IDs, and allow tribes to acquire mail-in ballots more fully. So that's pending. It's not certainly not going anywhere this Congress, but it is a start. Often these kinds of bills get introduced in a series of congressional sessions before they go anywhere. And I think it's possible, if a new Voting Rights Act moves forward, that these specific provisions of the Native American Voting Rights Act restoration may also come into play.
Thank you, Ms. Steele, for those for sharing those words with us. I really appreciate that, and I like the detail that you went into on all the different aspects of how voting was, the privilege of voting was being restricted to Native people, and going into some discussion about the legalities of it. We had a question in the question and answer module or prompt that asked if anyone on the panel had experience working with the Rural Utah Project in San Juan County and with the Navajo Nation, and what your opinion was as to whether how the Rural Utah Project ensured voting access to the Navajo Nation there. And I know, Justin, that you probably worked with this group a little bit, and if you could share your experience with them, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2018, and this was talked about, there were new districts drawn in San Juan County. And anytime new districts are drawn, one of the jobs of a county clerk is to make sure all the voters are in the correct district. Now, when you have at-large districts, it's very easy. Everyone in the county is in the same district. When you draw smaller districts, then you have to make sure that everyone is in the correct district so they get the correct ballot. And as was also just talked about, addressing issues are sometimes difficult. Someone may not have a street address. Their address is 2 miles northeast of pick your landmark. And so one of the things Rural Utah Project did was did a lot of work going out and helping residents and voters register to vote at the correct location. Now I say location instead of address because address was not always the best indicator of where someone lived. Now we're fortunate here in Utah that we actually have GIS capabilities in our voter registration system. If we have a map, we can put a pin in that map and know on the XY coordinates where someone lives. So Rural Utah Project went out and did a lot of work getting people registered to vote, updating registrations, and making sure they're in the correct district, which then makes sure people are getting the right ballot to vote on the correct candidates. You don't vote on every candidate, you vote on the candidates in your district. So I think Rural Utah Project did a lot of work there. They did some good work there. And came up with some creative ways to get people registered at those correct locations. So we worked with them quite a bit. I don't think we figured out all of the final solutions to how to maybe get people registered at the correct location when addressing is difficult. But I think they helped us get some good steps to helping people get registered in the right places.
Thank you, Justin. We also had another question that came to us on our Facebook Live, and the question was, they're wondering about the population of San Juan County and how much of that population was Native American. I looked up the 2010, and hopefully I'm reading this right, but it looks like there's about, and at least in 2010, there was about 15,000 residents of San Juan County. And it says that the Native population there, the non-Hispanic Native population, accounted for about 49% of the population there. So if that is totally off, someone please correct me, but that's what I was able to find.
So I may be off here as well. The 15,000 number, that's the number I have as well. It was my understanding that the Navajo population was closer to 51% of the population at this point. That was some of the reason for, I think, the discussions around the redistricting. But I mean, a couple percentage points either way, it's pretty close to evenly split.
It made a big deal in the case because the majority was Navajo, and you're right, it was about 52% at that point. So we're in 2020. I'll throw my plug out there right now. Everybody listening needs to take part in the census. And we're encouraging all tribal nations to please help your people and to get that census being taken and given correctly to the Census Bureau. And one question, and I'll start with Ronnie on this one. The question is, from everything that's been said and from what you've been seeing in your field and just in general, what are the biggest lessons that we can learn about voting rights more generally from this history of Native American voting rights that we've been kind of going over, and this topic we've been going over today?
I think that folks can be under the impression that that voting rights are settled, and that things aren't under dispute. That we can celebrate something like the year 2020 is 100 years since women have the right to vote. But that's not quite accurate, right? Not all women got the right to vote in 1920. White women were able to, achieve the right to vote, or obtain the right to vote. I guess they didn't really achieve it. It had to be kind of granted to them in a way. And so this voting is always this contested space, and that we always need to be sort of on the lookout. And I think that for my students, I think that there's often sort of this sort of sense that you turn 18 and then bam, it's just automatic, you have the right to vote, and then that's just it's just easy peasy, and that there isn't necessarily a consideration of what might inhibit that right to vote. What other barriers might there be in place? Are there people in the United States who are citizens of the United States who are of legal age, who do not currently have whatever the right to vote? I mean, we're seeing in the state of Florida a lot of negotiation and around individuals who are are leaving the criminal justice system, who are who are looking to have their voting rights re-established. And Florida, having a lot of conversation about whether they want to allow that or not. Again, in the state of Utah, we're very fortunate. I believe in that we're not having that argument. That we believe that folks can reestablish that right, and people who are in jail are able to vote. Although, correct me if I just made a mistake on that deal. And so we, that voting isn't just automatic, and it's contested. And I think that we need to stay in that conversation, and stay aware and stay alert, and stay active in that conversation.
Thank you. Ms. Steele, would you like to respond to that same question as well? So what can we learn about voting rights generally from the history of Native American voting rights?
Yeah, so while there are protections for discrimination on the basis of race, in theory, sometimes when the obstacles to having your vote fully counted aren't necessarily tied to race, and even under the question of race, Native Americans who are members of tribes are not always covered under the Equal Protection Clause because they are members of a political organization, the tribes, and so we don't always get as searching of a protection under the Equal Protection Clause as a category of race. And we have some good reasons why we don't necessarily want to be considered as a racial category. But I think some of the current threats to voting don't necessarily come. I'm not sure that, I mean, at least the court found in North Dakota, it wasn't necessarily that they didn't want Native people to vote because they were Native. It was because they were Democrats for the most part. And so things can stand in that there's theories of discrimination under the civil rights laws that for the Equal Protection Clause to be violated, there has to be intent to discriminate on the basis of a protected trait. You have to prove intentional discrimination. That's really hard. And just, a political party is not a protected trait. And so I think the way that voting districts are apportioned, the way the districts get drawn, can sometimes, that's gerrymandering, right? That privileges the party in power and dilutes minority voices. That that can have secondary impacts on Native Americans, or where you can't get the minority voices, right? We've always aspired to be a country that has in place some counter-majoritarian influences so that we don't have a dictatorship of the majority, tyranny of the majority, but that we've always respected political minority rights. Has been our aspiration. I'm not saying we've lived up to it. But I know there's been much discussion in recent years because of gerrymandering that happens, that politicians choose their voters instead of the voters choosing their politicians. And so paying attention on not just national elections, but the state elections, your state senate, your state representatives, and fully participating. I have sensed in some of my meetings with tribal members in Utah, more of a kind of a spirit of kagama, that we don't really interact with the state, that we're at odds with the state, but we can't be left out. Our voices in Utah can't be left out of the state political conversations, and so the way the districts are drawn, we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention to gerrymandering, and not let it be that politicians choose their voters, but that the voters choose our leaders and hold our leaders accountable. There was for my tradition, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people, we sent delegates to the Great Iroquois Confederacy, and women, certain grandmothers kind of held the title to those seats. They sent men, but they could remove those men from their seats if they did not consider the consequences of their actions on the next 7 generations. They were responsible to be that forward thinking. What are the consequences of our decisions and deliberations on the next 7 generations? And then if they acted in self-interest, if they acted in a way that promoted their self-interest, those were legitimate bases for being removed from office. We still have that power. The vote is the power to remove from office those who are short-sighted, those who are self-interested, those who aren't considering the coming generations. So I guess that's what I would add on that.
Thank you. Just in the interest of time, Justin, I want to throw a question at you. If you could name one thing the state could do to better their process and procedures, and then also name one thing that tribal governments could do to help the state better the voting process and procedures, would you be able to answer that or share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can. That's a great question. I think I'm going to take the second half first. Honestly, most of my experience in the last couple of years has been with the Navajo Nation, and what I will say is continue to do what's been done in the last couple of years, and that is let us know if there are problems. Let us know if there are things that we don't understand. I will be the first to admit that we're not experts in everything. And I think, Dustin, you made a great comment earlier about culturally choosing your leaders face to face and the importance of that. And there are times when I'm happy and willing to admit that that's just not something that necessarily crosses my mind. And so having those conversations, setting those letters, setting up those meetings, I think is so important to help us get the context. And then I think that segues into what I think we can do better. And that's listening. And then when we find things that we can take action on, is to do that. One of the difficulties that I talked about at the very first is there is a difference between, the authority we have and the authority that a local election official has. But the ability to get people at the table and talking is important. So just to reiterate it, to the tribes, I'd say keep doing what you're doing. Let us know what we need to be doing better. Let us know the things that we don't understand, the things that we're not catching. This has been a phenomenally good panel from my perspective, not because of anything that I've said, but just the things that I've heard and that I've learned. And then I think we need to make sure that we're aware of that when we're talking about the whole state, we need to be aware that there are certain places where things may not work the same, where there's different needs, there's different cultures, there's different backgrounds. So vote by mail, for example, may work really well in most of the state, and it's not just San Juan County, but there are some areas that we may need to look at doing things different. So a lot of it comes down to the communication.
Thank you. Same question, Ms. Draper. What do you think tribes could do better, and don't limit it to just tribal governments, but maybe individual natives? And what do you think this state and county governments could do better?
I think that it goes back to what Michalyn was talking about. In some ways, or like the way that I interpreted it and was thinking about the answer, or the thing that she was talking about was that there needs to be some cooperation. But I think that I mean, and part of what we're talking about can help the solution, as we see in San Juan County, is that we put tribal members, indigenous people, not just about removing barriers to vote, but this then opens the possibility to putting tribal members in elected positions in county offices, state offices, national offices. As we've seen, I think that we've seen an influx of indigenous people, Native American peoples, throughout government in recent elections. And I think that in part will solve some of the issues that Dustin brings up, when he talks about, we just don't know. We don't know these cultural issues, and we need to listen, and we need to understand. Part of that listening and part of that understanding will take place when there are tribal members, when there are indigenous people sitting in those offices, not as visitors, not as guests, but as actual elected officials, people who are taking up office and who are then able to assert their voices in a way that can be heard. And I think that that is also the power of the vote. And so I think that's something for us to consider, for our young people to consider, for us to nurture our young people to consider, in what ways could they be prepared to serve in public office and to serve in sort of this dual capacity that allows them to serve both their native peoples and the people of the wider state or nation. And I think that we can do some work to prepare in that way, and so that is work that we can do both as tribal people, but then as people who are in the state, right? That we have a responsibility as folks in the state. I'm an educator, as someone who prepares teachers to help them think about, how do we work with children? How do we think about curriculum? How do we teach young people about voting and about public service, so that folks, regardless of their background, but regardless of their tribal affiliation, will also consider electing people to lend voice to different ideas, different solutions, those sorts of things. So, that work is on both sides.
Thank you. Ms. Steele, do you have anything to add on that?
No, I think that's well said.
All right. So we had a question in the question answer prompt, and it addressed, I'll just read it. It says the question pertains to Native American voting rights in Utah. I have learned that widespread Indian access to the vote in the state did not occur until 1951, but I have also learned that this did not happen until 1962. Could any of you elaborate on the process which finally permitted Indian voting in Utah? Why was the state last, particularly during an era of termination and assimilation? This fact has always surprised me, especially considering how Utah was rather early on granting the vote to women. I did, this was posted by Carla Wakefield. I did post a short answer in the under that, but I think Ms. Dill, answered this some but there, I do, one thing to consider, there was the Attorney General's opinion that was issued, and one of the big things on that was whether or not Indians in Utah were actually citizens actually citizens of the state or residents of the state. And it took an Attorney General's opinion to say yes, they were, and then later, that was countered. But a lot of that argument was carried on because Native people, especially reservation residents, probably don't have a lot of the same taxing obligations that a lot of citizens, and you should know, Native Americans pay federal taxes. If they work off reservation, they pay income tax, and if they live off reservation, they pay property tax. But property taxes probably on reservations there's no obligation on that end. And so there was this, hey, if you're not taxing, if you're not paying into the system, we probably don't want you participating in the system. That was part of that argument, and there was a number of different arguments that went around the whole state. And as Justin said, each county was in charge of their voting practices, and so you had to work through those. And so if the dates don't always match up, that's a thing that can relate to that. Another thing is, I see a comment from Ms. Steele, and I think I'll let her elaborate more on that answer or response.
Yeah, just that, this issue was resolved ultimately by the legislature of Utah. And what I find interesting is that the Utah Supreme Court found, in the case to do with the gentleman from the Ute Reservation who was suing to be able to vote in the state elections, that the Utah Supreme Court found that they didn't, they ruled against him and basically said that because of tribal sovereignty, because the first allegiance of tribal members was to the sovereign of the tribe, that was one of the reasons that they didn't think that the tribal members were adequately invested in the state of Utah to participate in the elections. I think we have heard in the public discussion echoes of the similar kinds of things in San Juan County. And so that is not, the idea that tribes have sort of this split allegiance and aren't really invested or aren't really part of state processes, or as Dustin was saying, because their lands are held in trust by the federal government, they're not subject to taxation by the state per se, that might be some basis in which they're not fully invested citizens of the state of Utah. I think that's false, and I find it really interesting that the political branch of the state legislature remedied it rather than the what is supposed to sort of protect the minority interest better, which is the court, which found against the gentleman who was suing for his voting rights, but somehow the political branches, the representative branches, facilitated the vote by statute.
And we have another question, and I'll let anyone answer this, but have there been any successful campaigns, particularly in San Juan County, where Natives comprise about half of the population, for tribal members to hold public office? And I think we've seen that, especially in San Juan County. They have 3 county commissioners. After redrawing the voting district lines to be more proportionate according to the populations that live there, 2 of the 3 county commissioner seats are currently held by Navajo citizens. And so thanks for that question. That it's been working, but I think, in the end, there's still a need for people to vote. You know, one of the voting districts in those county commissioner elections is fairly non-Indian. One is fairly Navajo, and one is right in the middle. And there's one that can go either way, you know, on at least one seat down there in San Juan County. And so I think it goes back a lot to what our panelists have been saying, is that you have to get out and vote. You have to participate, you know, and you have to take part and be actively interested in these politics that affect so much. It looks like we're hitting at 10:30 right now, so I would just like to thank all the panelists. If you could all turn your cameras back on, so our participants can see you and get your face burned into their mind and recognize if they see you in the street. I'd like to thank Michalyn Steele, Justin Lee, and Ronnie Joe Draper. I'd like to, to carry on what everyone said on this panel, speak up, and voice your concerns to your tribal governments, to your state governments, and as Justin said, if you're a tribal government, speak out to your state government and consult with one another, communicate with one another. Ms. Steele, great point. Just as much as voting allows us to choose who our representatives will be, it allows us to choose who they will not be in the future. You can put people in office, or you can remove people in office voting. And I think we all need to remember that. And for Ms. Draper, just really be aware. Pointing out that so many different Native people around the country are running for Congress and holding office, winning those races. Be aware of that. Be aware of their stance. Be aware of their issues, and participate. This is for my students. It's time to take your screenshot. This is me doing the peace symbol. I have been taking pictures of the names on the list of who's attending, but hey, thank you for attending, and thank you for being part of this. And I'll turn time over back to Holly George with the state, with state history.
Hey, thank you. It was a distinguished panel and a very, very important and interesting discussion. I'm thrilled to have been part of it. I'd like to remind everyone to please join us at 11:30 on Zoom for our keynote address, which will be continuing this discussion of voting rights, talking about the history of the 19th Amendment, the ongoing history of this, with Dr. Lisa Tetrault from Carnegie Mellon.